So before we go into the questions, I just want to say that I'm really excited to be here. And I want to explain why I'm excited to be here. When I was a Christian believer, I would, while I was in high school, I would go on these weekend retreats. How many of you all have ever gone on a weekend retreat, spiritual retreat, or what have you? And we would go on these, and that whole weekend we'd be indoctrinated, and we'd hear all this intense religiosity and everything, all this talk, all this rhetoric from the Bible, and I ate it up. And my practical approach to the entire weekend was, I want to hear something. I want something to be said that I can take back to my high school and set it on fire for Jesus and turn people's lives around and really make an impact. And that's why I was excited about this conference. Not because of the Jesus stuff, but because I want to hear something. That's my practical approach, even in this. I want to hear something. And that should be your approach as well, I believe. Hear something that you can take back to your community, take back to your school, take back to your town, and get the fire rolling in terms of making a difference, having an impact on your community. I believe Che Guevara was the one who said, the true revolutionary is motivated by love. If you really love people, if you really want to make a difference in people's lives, you do it out of love, and you do it out of empowering yourself and educating yourself. And that's what we're here for today. And that's why you all have all assembled here today. So I'd like everyone to take a minute to give yourselves a hand as well. Now we're going to move on to business. The topic of today's panel, it's called, What's Race Got to Do with It? Racial Politics and Intersectionality in the Atheist Movement. Moderator, don't do that. I'm sorry. That's me. Okay. So, question number one. This is the first question we're going to pose to the panel. Which prominent movement, group, or individual, past or present, strikes you as being particularly effective at articulating the concept of intersectionality and or addressing racism's nuances in a manner worthy of being implemented by others who are interested in tackling such issues? That's our first question. Who wants to take the first? Who wants to take that? Frank, I see.
Yeah, one of the light bulb heroes when I was going to Illinois back in the late 70s was Asa Randolph. He actually organized a march back in 1941, way before King even thought about it. He forced the president to come up with new legislation to eliminate discrimination. He always put the words down that we're going to eliminate discrimination in the military services. He also he was part of the 1963 march for Washington with Dr. King. He was right in that. So he's my hero, and I think he had a lot to do with the movement.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Part of what Frank is alluding to is how religious people have reappropriated the civil rights movement and said it was a religious movement, but most of the most profound and effective architects of that movement were men such as A. Philip Randolph and the guy, I can't think of his name. Bayard Rustin, people like that, who were non-believers, but who were instrumental and who were like, laid the groundwork for King. Okay, back to the panel.
I think that the Black Lives Matter is doing a really good job, and I think that it's also, it can be used later on to explain the nuances of intersectionality, because it's actually done by Black people. I feel like there's been a total mission creep on, like, for example, Bernie Sanders talking about racism. The last thing I want is for white people to learn about, like, intersectionality from the white person. That doesn't make any sense. So the Black Lives Matter does something that is also really effective, and that's naming and shaming, which unfortunately it has to be done. It works very well. And I'm not saying to burn bridges, but naming and shaming has made this movement what it is now. Every time that there's a conference, people are at least focusing on, whether or not there's women, whether or not there's people of color. And that's because people are naming and shaming.
Yeah, I apologize if this doesn't quite directly answer the question, but I think it's a very common theme in the free thought movement to draw comparisons between us and the LGBT rights movement, because clearly there are certainly parallels. Clearly, it's probably the most successful civil rights movement since the civil rights movement in terms of its impact on legislation, its impact on changing cultural perceptions. And of course, someone in the audience right now, Greta Christina, has done a great talk on that, where she talks about the similarities in movements and what we do have to learn from it. Of course, as anyone who was in the last panel, the LGBT panel, now knows, clearly there are major issues with regard to diversity and intersectionality within the LGBT rights movement, just as there are in the free thought movement. I think that's obviously a very powerful reminder to all of us just how much, even something like the LGBT rights movement that you would, have very high expectations of, just like some may have very high expectations with regard to the free thought movement, with regard to diversity and intersectionality. Clearly, we can both fall prey to the problems, for different reasons, of course, when it comes to the two movements.
I think the largest movement is probably Black Lives Matter, and while it was started in part by queer feminists of color, the overall movement has yet to get to where it needs to be in terms of intersectionality. Many of the people involved in Black justice now are what they call the Hotepers, and I actually recently attended a Hotep meeting on rape. And while it was a step in the right direction, it kind of, they taught that rape was started by Europeans during slavery, and so it kind of removed the issue from the Black community and allowed for the defense of people like Bill Cosby and R. Kelly and things like that. So I think we have a long way to go, but spaces like this and the visibility that we create in these spaces will make more household names and household movements. So something like the Wanda Alston Foundation, which is an organization I'm on the board of in DC, that focuses on queer homeless youth, and 100% of our youth are African American, and majority of them have been victims of religious discrimination by their own families, and which is one of the causes of their homelessness. But when we think about HIV criminalization, we think about domestic violence, and these things, they really need to be as central as police brutality in this movement, and the leaders need to be talking about these as frequently. So I think there's a lot of growth, and as secularists, we have the capacity to address these issues like reproductive rights that religionists may not have the tools to address because of their narrow scope of communication.
I think as a Latino, I have to rescue my history in the sense that not everybody has been Catholic forever. Not everybody, I'm not a new thing. Just because I'm a Puerto Rican atheist doesn't mean that there has been I'm the first Puerto Rican ever who realized that God doesn't exist. And so one writer that I always love, here's the other thing, I like writers more than activists, even if some are activists, is Nemesio Canales. It's early 20th century, late 19th century Puerto Rican intellectual. Unfortunately, he was a lawyer too. But let's bypass that for a moment. I read about him. I loved him when I was in high school because he basically wrote a lot about social justice and used humor to basically talk about inequality. What I didn't know until I was older was that he was also a spoken atheist, and they don't teach you this in Catholic school, apparently. And so I started reading, and not only he was talking about wealth inequality, and he was talking about a lot of the issues that were happening in Puerto Rico at the dawn of the 20th century, right after the U.S. occupation and all the injustices that were occurring there. But he was also an advocate for women and writing about feminism before it was cool in the island. And I mean, my wife and I love him so much that, you know, partially our son is named after him. The other half of his name is Benito Juarez. He's half Mexican, so we have to balance the thing. But yeah, you know, when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about how to rescue our Latino leaders, and then Benito Juarez is certainly another name that comes to this, and basically I think the role I wanna play and what I wanna tell people is that, you know, we're here, but we're not new. We just don't know our history, and that, you know, some people has taken this mantle before.
We're talking about intersectionality and what we can learn from as far as individuals, groups, or movements. You know, the media and what we generally think about Black Lives Matter movement, we think about them combating racial injustice and police brutality. But if you, I mean, they even have it on their website. If you go to the website and you can look at their guiding principles, they're explicitly queer and trans inclusive. So they go after and they dismantle, well, they speak on these things. They try to combat various forms of social inequality. So not only racial injustice, but they also try to talk about and address and expose issues related to trans antagonism or heteronormativity or ableism and so on. So I think that when we're talking about social justice and social justice from intersectional lens, I think we do have to look at this group that is out there in your face, aggressive, because I mean, there's no progress without confrontation. I mean, that's Frederick Douglass said that even people who are atheists who revere Christopher Hitchens, he also said the same thing. You know, there is no progress without confrontation. He said the same thing. So I mean, another thing that I do think was brought to the table by the Black Lives Matter movement is something like words of wisdom from Audre Lorde. We can't, there's no such thing as a single issue agenda because we don't lead single issue lives. So I think that it's important for us to remember that. I wrote something more recently that got a lot of flack from people who don't want to talk about anything other than separation of church and state. When I was talking about the plague of single issue propaganda, I'm not saying that it's not important to address those issues that are commonly like what's become mainstream, the mainstream agenda, that we want to focus so much on these issues that don't have to do with marginalized groups. So yes, we can talk about separation of church and state, but what are we doing about the people who are affected by that, but also affected by race and racism? When you're being erased in a myriad of other ways that aren't talked about by these organizations or these individuals who want to promote a very narrow lens of justice.
And I think the LGBTQ community has been playing the long game probably more so than any of the other movements out there. So I would love to use them as a continuous baseline as to where we are, especially in the continuum of ending systemic oppression. But when I take a look at what's happening now, what's immediate to me, it's almost, it's always Black Lives Matter. And how people say, I don't like their tactics, I don't like their methods. But being able to corral or get those 15 minutes with both of the candidates and having a few platforms that are actually addressing our issues, that's highly effective. So that is something that I think we can't take anything away from. They have been extraordinarily effective at doing what they've done. So going out there and shutting down a highway, going out there and shutting down an airport, interrupting a speech that, a political speech that has nothing to do with you. And unless you interject your name, your voice,
it will never reference or encapsulate anything that matters to you or your being. They don't like that. And so it goes back to being invisible again. They want us to be more invisible, and we won't.
Okay, moving on, next question. And that was, Georgina, you referenced Bernie Sanders earlier, and that can help us segue into our next question. The two-part question, the additional part of that first question. Within the political arena, which present-day national leaders, if any, appear poised to effectively address such issues and inspire others to do the same? The issue of intersectionality, racism, the nuances of such. Who on the current scene, what political leaders seem, now you mentioned Bernie Sanders earlier. Some would argue that out of all the candidates, he's most worthy.
That's true, but that's not saying a lot.
Yeah.
And I wrote this down in my notes. For the audience he has that speak his lingo, he is a very much an ally to intersectionality. But, you know, as an educator, I think it should be coming from someone else, someone of color. And Barack Obama does not really educate people on intersectionality. I could be wrong, but I have not heard anything where I was like, wow, that really hits the nail on the head when it comes to intersectionality. And I can't think of anyone big enough. I can think of some little mayors, like, you know, especially a senator from Nebraska, I think, but nobody that's on the political scene that I can, you know, that I can mention and everyone would know. I can't think of anyone.
Okay.
I mean, I agree that, yeah, certainly he is the best in that regard, that we have. But, you know, and a lot of people, I think, maybe have an impression that he's, you know, he certainly has a very distinguished track record at certain points throughout his career with regard to civil rights, going back many decades. In recent years, however, you know, he's really focused so much on economic injustice. Very, very important issue, which obviously crosses over very much with racial issues. You know, there's a lot of, you know, intersections there. But, you know, I know he's been criticized at times, probably rightfully so, for focusing on that, you know, to the exclusion of actual specific racial issues by just always going to his bread and butter of the economic issues.
Actually, I think that's actually a very good point, because we're talking about, can we name any leaders that are influencing this? And I think we're dealing with a little bit of a shift, because especially when you look at Black Lives Matter, it's a leaderless movement, right? It's cell-based, it's decentralized, etc. And we can't ignore the impact of what they're doing politically. So I would say that we're actually seeing the advent of the leaderless movement. There's not an MLK that we can pin down and then vilify. There's no X that we can do the same thing to. It's a movement. I am the movement. We are the movement. You got to go after all of us, and you can't do that.
But it's very possible that the reason why there isn't a Black candidate or a Latino or a woman candidate or anyone of intersectionality is because someone of that personality is not allowed, has been, you know, cut off by society to join those ranks. And it's not a mindset that is very comfortable to the political society here in the United States. So basically it's because of the conservative and white supremacist society we have, the reason why we don't have a great candidate or someone to learn intersectionality about, it's because society won't allow it.
Precisely, that's what I was actually trying to get into. It's not the problem that there's no such kind of leader, it's that the political structure that we have doesn't allow that type of leadership to rise to the top. So if I were to answer the question, I would say nobody, maybe Donald Trump, because he's uniting a lot of people by pissing them off. But other than that, so he's very intersectional in the way he pisses people off. But other than that, I don't think, you know, the way that we do our political system is structured in terms of the two-party system and the nominating processes actually allows for real progressive voices for social justice to rise to that level.
Yeah.
Actually, to tie in both race and economics when it comes to Bernie Sanders, that was going to be my answer too. But not because I think that he isn't problematic. I do think he has some issues with his campaign too, but I mean, they all do. But as far as, I would say that he's the closest to addressing social inequalities on a substantive level. I think that he's the closest to that. and to address both the economics issue that was brought up and then also the race issue. More recently, there was, in like the last week or so, there was flack that was brought up because he said that he opposes reparations. And so political scientist and professor Adolph Reed, he spoke about this a couple days ago, whatever, and he considers the criticism that has started to develop because he said that he's against reparations, just like all the rest of the candidates are. He said that the criticism is so utterly empty that he, and beside the point that he can't even characterize it. And I'm actually going to quote what he said when he's talking about Sanders. He said, "You can go down Sanders' platform issue by issue and ask, so how is this not a black issue? How is a $15 minimum wage not a black issue? How is massive public work employment not a black issue? How is free public college higher education not a black issue? The criminal justice stuff and the rest of it." So one head-scratching aspect of this is, what do people like Ta-Nehisi Coates imagine is to be gained by calling the redistribution program and racial and calling it reparations? So just because Bernie Sanders isn't ostensibly in support of reparations, we have to look at what he's trying to accomplish.
So, during last year's conference, we explored whether atheist organizations of color should strive through their objectives and their outreach to be more inclusive and enlightened with those unaware of intersectionality's impact upon the lives of people of color. Now, when that question was raised, when it was originally posed last year, Tamir Rice and Senator Bland were still alive. Student activists at the University of Missouri had not fought with success to have its president resign. And Trump's presidential candidacy had yet to be announced. So, in light of all that's transpired within that year or so, let's explore the question once more. Do you believe there's more, less, or no obligation whatsoever to include and enlighten non-people of color, unaware of how intersectionality affects our daily lives? Yes, Georgina.
So, to me, I remember in the last panel, I can't remember who it was, but they're like, it's not my job. Why am I teaching people about something that they should know about? Okay, but think about future generations. Personally, I would want people to learn from me about intersectionality and its nuances and the way that it affects people, so then future generations can have a little domino effect for a more equitable society. So yeah, I think it's a duty. And we can't stop racism from happening, but we can lessen the blow, we can educate people, because from what we see, education is key to everything. I think it's a little bit irresponsible for people to just shun people, and that's why I say you can name and shame, but don't shun, because how is that going to make anything better? It's not. You need white allies to make things better, and there's some amazing white allies in there, and we should give them a little bit of slack, because they are trying. They're trying to understand us, and honestly, where would we be without them? They are the majority, after all. We do need their help. And I think that a lot of people of color, atheists of color, have lost faith in the atheist community because it's so whitewashed, but they also don't understand, and I think that this is an American problem, that secularism is a matter of life and death in other countries. Look at Bangladesh. People are being systematically killed there because they're atheists. So if we don't take hold of this movement, the secular movement, then it's not going to have a domino effect. I mean, the United States, unfortunately, I don't like this country that much. It has a domino. It affects foreign policy everywhere. It's one of the 5 powers. So, in the atheist movement and in society and in the world at large, people of color are responsible for educating and stepping on people's toes. Because like I said, Nothing is gonna be given to us. If you think that, you're wrong. You're wrong, and just look at history. So we have to step on people's toes and educate them as well. And we have to do it in a way that's interrupting, because look at Black Lives Matter. They're educating people that don't want to be educated. So, I mean, even if your racist neighbor doesn't want to hear it, he's going to. It's going to happen.
Okay, but you raised something. Now, stepping on people's toes, is that implicit? Does that happen automatically when you enlighten and when you strive to enlighten and educate, or is that an added component? Something that you think is just as crucial?
I'm going to steal a quote from one of the women in the feminist panel. Just being merely existing as a woman of color, not even in the atheist movement, but in the world unapologetically, is stepping on people's toes. So your presence is already stepping
Your
on toes.
very presence.
Yeah, my very breath. So, I mean, have I gotten used to that? Have I gotten used to the tokenization? Sure. Does it bother me? Of course. Am I going to do it? Yes, because I want to leave this world in a better place, and I'm going to have to swallow my pride sometimes, walk into a room full of white people, and be the token girl and explain to them what intersectionality is so their kids can have a better life and spread an equitable society.
Yeah, regarding your question, I guess I'm very hesitant to say that it is ever more or less important to educate people about these issues and speak out about, issues like racial injustice as a response to any particular current event. I mean, clearly when you have incidents like Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, all these things we've seen, these are a big deal. These are things that must be spoken out about, must be, cannot be ignored, right? Not to diminish the significance of these incidents, but I think that it's tempting to say that, that means we should be more emphasizing of these issues. I think that regardless of what happens in current events, these are important issues. These are core issues of humanism. If you want to embrace humanistic principles, speaking out for the oppressed and the underprivileged and against injustices, that's a core principle of humanism, regardless of what happens regardless of current events. I mean, if we go, let's say we go a month where miraculously there are no incidents, in the media, no major incidents in the media, let's say, of major racial injustices or brutality, well, that doesn't change the fact that it's just as important to speak out on it and emphasize that in terms of educating people about these issues.
I've been in the movement for a while now, and one of the things that I realized is even when you make it inside the gate, you're still outside the wall, right? So it's not one movement, right? So wrestling away control of one movement doesn't happen because it's a separate movement. What we're sitting in here you may want to call it a sub-movement or a movement of many or it's a different movement. Right? It's not just an issue of scope creep. It is an issue of need, want, and motivation. It's just like when we start talking about atheist versus humanism. My humanism says, yeah, as soon as I hear all Black Lives Matter, my response is, hell yeah, all Black Lives Matter, regardless of my skin tone. That should be the response. And if you're a human, but what we do know is not all atheists are humanists. So we can't try and wrestle control of that larger secularist movement because it hasn't really worked. When you are talking to those that do listen, they're in a different movement. You're enlisting them in to a different movement.
Can I address that? I think that you're right. There's some people whose mind you cannot change, but because of us stepping on people's toes and demanding equality not only in this movement, but in this world as a whole, even those, I think that it's a step forward that having, racism has become so unacceptable in many, many, many communities that people think twice before they say something racist. And I think that is a progress forward. So even though we might not changing their mind, at least they're not spewing hate because it's no longer acceptable. Like I said, it's not because it's he's not doing it because it's right, but because it's no longer effective. Like, it's not, it's just, and that matters because he's not teaching hate to the next generation.
So to chime in, as far as the duty of oppressed people to be in charge of ending their own oppression, ideally, I don't think that that is the case. I don't think that it is the obligation of myself as a Black woman to go and go out of my wing, go educate people. Hey, you shouldn't be racist. Hey, you shouldn't be sexist. You shouldn't be this. Really, that is the duty of the oppressor. So rape is not going to end because I, as a woman, say I think rape should end. Rape is going to end in an act that men consciously do that puts the onus on them. So it's not the victim who is the person that's responsible for bringing about social change or social justice. Clearly there's racism in the secular community. When Black activists interrupted Bernie Sanders, the first opposition I heard about that in the white liberal community came from secular organizations, Secular Voice. I'm not sure if you all heard or read the same articles that I did that were saying, these Black women are basically idiots because Bernie Sanders is so great and loves Black people, when at that time he didn't have a racial justice platform, and these women were very aware that Bernie Sanders is a liberal, and their action was very effective. But even though there is racism in the secular community, I don't necessarily feel it's the obligation of people of color to go in and solve that single-handedly. I think what's most effective is to highlight and support the people of privilege who use their privilege to unpack their privilege and to fight for intersectionality. So the Black men, the cisgender heterosexual Black men that I know that are on the front lines for Black trans women, and the white people that I know that are challenging their white peers in circles, are the ones that I feel they're doing their duty. That's your obligation, that's your responsibility. I'm going to support you, I'm going to retweet you. But at the end of the day, even though it's not my obligation, Audre Lorde was mentioned earlier, our silence is not going to protect us. So even though it's not my job, in an ideal world, people of privilege would go about unpacking their privilege and educating their privileged peers about how this is unacceptable. We can't just sit back and watch people take advantage of us. So it's kind of not clear how it should be addressed, but that's one effective strategy that I found, is supporting those individuals of privilege who actively unpack their privilege.
I go back and forth on this question, and I think lately I've been more on the side that Georgina has mentioned, in the sense that this movement, the secular movement, it runs on inertia. Like, I can't believe how many times I've been to, trying to get into activities and trying to go to events, and it's like all debates about the existence of God. Like, how does that change my life? How does that improve? Like, debating about God, how does that improve our life? We already know that there's no God. What's the whole point about it? Or like more science education. How does, how teaching a kid to code when he can't actually eat is going to improve his life or her life? And my favorite question of all, like, when they see me there, it's like, how do we get more people like you? And I was like, well, you have a lot of men in here. You have a lot of people with PhDs in here. You mean Latinos? Well, stop doing this. And talk about issues that actually people care about. If I'm an atheist, I know God doesn't exist, so why should I come to another thing? Like, why don't you talk about issues that as a human is actually affect me? And that's what it basically, that's why I'm moving now into that direction, realizing that there are layers of privilege. And that, I may be a Latino and I get a lot of flack because of that, but at the end of the day, I also have a very cushy job, and I have a PhD, and I get access to places where other people like me don't have, and I should use that power in order to, make a difference.
Yeah, so the question is talking about, we're operating under the assumption of an obligation, if we're obligated, okay? If we're obligated to teach non-people of color. And so, I mean, as far as that obligation, I'm going to say that it depends. Because what's already been said here, I kind of flip-flop on this too, because I see it two different ways. Because I get the people who are tired, or they'll say, and I have a really good friend, she's a black woman, she's also a powerful writer. But when it comes to addressing these issues and trying to reach out to non-people of color, she said, I'm tired of doing it. I was like, why? Why am I going to keep on investing in myself? They don't listen, they're going to keep on doing it. So I get that, because sometimes I get burned out too. So I mean, we live in a white-oriented culture where when there's any acute departure from the status quo, the reaction is ideological recoil. They don't want to hear. So it depends. I say that it depends because also it's like, if you're someone who recognizes that there's many manifestations of discrimination and oppression that affects all of us, well, many of us on different levels. If we understand the way that the intersection of identities work, if we know all of these things, then if you're someone who knows this and knows that these issues affect others as far as emotionally, even physically, and mentally, then I would say that it's almost an act of intellectual malpractice to just sit back and say, okay, I'm just going to let this keep on happening. So even though I see both sides, it's like, if you know these things and you know that speaking up could cause some semblance of a butterfly effect, where you talk about these things and you expose them and you reach out to people and you try and work with people and you bring them up to speed on why this issue is problematic or why we need to talk about this and why we need to discuss this, then it can cause a butterfly effect where that person will, out of however many people, you have someone, you plant a seed, you become a catalyst for change, and they no longer do whatever it is, and then they pass it along to future generations.
And I think it's important that we do communicate to other people who may not know. So I think it's important that we work with everyone.
We've had events such as, Black Atheist meet and greets. This was before there was the Houston Black Non-Believer Group. We used to hold some of these, Black Atheist events. We also currently do like a Spanish-speaking event. Anyway, point being that almost every time, early on at least, there would be somebody who would always chime in and say things like, oh, why are you having, what's the point of having this? Why, would you have a white, atheist event? Things like that. Really just the most vapid, just stupid responses you can imagine. And when I would see these, I would be like, oh, great, we have a racist on our hands, and, what am I going to say? Well, and I would take the high ground, be respectful, and just explain why we're doing it, what it's for. And I was surprised, actually. People that I thought was like, okay, this person is just being antagonistic and is trying to cause trouble. Well, in the vast majority of the cases, after I just responded and explained what's the purpose of this, why we're doing it, why it's important, why it's needed, they were like, oh, okay. Sometimes they were like, oh, okay, I understand that. So sometimes educate, even when it may seem like, oh, somebody's hopeless. In my experience, anyway, sometimes they do just need to be educated, even just on the basics, and that does help.
So in an ideal world, then the oppressed person should not have the burden of educating the oppressor or using direct action against the oppressor or demanding reparations or anything like that from the oppressor. The oppressor should know, okay, I did slavery, I'm going to give every black person $10 million, and that should just be the end of it, But without that actually happening, and without this being an ideal world, even though it's not our duty, our silence is not going to protect us, and we can't continue to be trampled and be quiet. And power usually does not concede anything without demand. So if you're looking at it practically, yes, unfortunately, we are obligated to educate, and even education, I think, is the nicest way that we can address our oppressions, but also I think it is effective to use more direct action type measures when necessary to that are nonviolent.
Okay, thank you. Piggybacking on that last question, about that last statement that Jimmie made about the duty of the oppressed, the duty or the burden of oppressed people to be responsible for ending their own oppressions. You mentioned how it's not their responsibility, or is it? What, if anything, is their responsibility in their oppression? Is there a responsibility that they should assume?
The responsibility isn't on them at all whatsoever. But when it comes to, we can't just sit here. So I mean, so it's not out of some type of imagined sectarian obligation or whatever, but it's out of moral obligation to want social progress, to want to alleviate the issue, however that may be, and whatever you have to do. So I still don't think we're not obligated to do anything.
Of course.
But as was said, I agree with her when she said that you can look at it philosophically and practically. When it comes to practical matters, when you live something, you live the true lived context of that daily, every day, what you have to endure. For me, let's just say, as being black, what you have to endure. Someone who isn't black, they can try to understand, but they'll never be able to fully comprehend what that's like. Whether it be the very minor stuff, I had this happen to me where you walk into a restaurant and you have two people sitting there looking at a menu, and you walk in and you're looking at a menu too, and the woman, she looks over her shoulder and she sees me and she walks over into the other side of her husband. So even little stuff like that to bigger things, when you get pulled over by the police, you're not thinking, oh man, I gotta deal with this. When you're a black person, you're thinking, what's gonna happen? So I mean, so for me, I'm trying to articulate these issues in a way that people who don't deal with them will see through my eyes. So the awareness can be upgraded through my hurt, my pain, and my perspective that they don't experience. And the same thing goes for when it comes to male privilege, toxic masculinity. We have to actually listen to women. We have to grant them a platform because I don't know what that's like. I don't know that being affected by patriarchy, sexism, and so on a day. I don't know what that's like. So it's all about, when you're talking about who's responsible, whatever, it's not really about that. It's about how am I going to get better? I get better by listening to the people who are suffering through the marginalization. So I can better be mindful of, okay, I see that as an issue now, and I understand why. So it would be the same thing with black people.
He spoke of this perception that all atheists are humanists.
What?
Right.
Are not.
Are not humanists, right. Upside down. Right. So, is that a communist perception?
I think a lot of atheists believe they're humanists, but once you test it, it's an easy litmus test. They're not, right? And I think a lot of us can really cite very quickly, but yeah, I had 10 that said that they were, and as soon as this came out, well, you're not.
Yes, Vic.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, even who identify as atheists and humanists, don't understand the terms. I mean, they don't understand what it means. They often use the terms interchangeably. They use them as synonyms. They often will use humanism, for example, say I'm a humanist, just because, oh, they don't like the word atheism, you know. And I feel like often, yeah, they're not informed about what it even means. I mean, there are people I have encountered firsthand who have almost no humanistic values whatsoever, have values and beliefs directly contradictory to humanism,
Yeah.
other than the atheism and other than, whatever, science, whatever, logic. Those, okay, sure, those are some principles of humanism. Yeah, sure, they accept those. But yet they're totally antagonistic, not just inconsistent with, in some cases, antagonistic to the other rest of the humanistic principles. And I see that shockingly, often, day to day, because we are a humanist group, And yeah, it does shock me just how often I see that. People who call themselves humanists, but they're, racist, bigoted, anti-feminist, sexist, misogynistic, whatever. I mean, yeah.
So, considering all that you've heard this weekend, all we've learned, all we've been empowered and inspired by, in the most practical terms, where do we go from here? In our communities, workplaces, schools, and so on. How do we go about mitigating the vestiges and prevailing onslaught of racism and intersectionality, overcoming the accompanying strongholds of poverty and religiosity in our communities, and working to orchestrate profound and lasting societal change? Where do we go from here?
I think there's two pieces to it, or two approaches. And I think we're doing a little bit of that today. The first one is really going back into our own communities, not the secular community, but where we live, and making a stand. And beginning to plant the seeds there and growing the numbers there, because that's where we need to really grow the numbers where we might be able to one day, and this is long game, be able to influence power, right? Because if you take a look at Black atheists in particular, I think we're at a fraction of 1%, right? We can't influence change that way. But within our own communities, if they allow us a platform, if we show them what intersectionality means and integrate secularism into that platform, it will give us an opportunity to grow those numbers. Now that's one. And the second one is to continue to challenge what we see in popular secularism, right? Don't ever give up the front or an inch on that front, because for every inch that you give, they'll take it back, right? And we are constantly fighting for that. So we should be writing, we should be arguing, we should be protesting, we should be boycotting, and we should be doing everything that we can to make sure, to make a statement.
If you think for a second that organizing in your community isn't important, look at Black Lives Matter. It was a small movement, now it's a national phenomenon. So you can affect change just by having your own organization, making collaborations with others. So organizing, I think, is really, really important.
Okay.
But I think we also need to get more involved in politics in a real sense, not just in the, oh yeah, we support LGBTQ rights, or we're against racism, we're in favor of police cancers, stuff like that, easy fixes, but actually get involved in, especially in local politics. I don't think, at the national level, there's nothing going to happen. Like, even in my day job, we're not even focusing on national politics and working a lot with local groups now. And in that regard, that we should stop complaining about the things don't change, like the religious right has so much power. Yeah, because they have a freaking 40-year head start.
And they organize well.
And they organize well as well. And so we need to have people who run for office, not because I want to be the atheist that want to show the point that atheists can run for office, but actually run for office in order to try to win it, not because I'm an atheist and try to get the votes of the 3 atheists in the county, but actually try to get people to vote for you because you're actually proposing something.
When like many humanist groups, right, groups that tend to identify as humanist, I've spoken with others around the country. It seems to be often the case, even more so than in other free thought groups, that they are overwhelmingly white, male, and older. Okay, right, and that is certainly was the case historically with our organization. We really made it a point of emphasis about a few years back to see what we could do to introduce diversity, bring in people of diverse backgrounds, diverse genders, and diverse ages. And how do we go about doing that? You know, it's a, you know, obviously there's no silver bullet to just magically make that happen. It's a big challenge. It's not easy. But, you know, some of the things we've tried to do, for example, is the fact that we are a humanist group gives us, not only gives us license to, but gives us a responsibility to embrace causes like social justice causes and speak out for, you know, equality and embrace, you know, LGBT rights, you know, racial issues. And these are issues that are important to younger people. These are important to minorities. You really want to grow the movement. You want to grow your organization. You want to be as accepting as possible to wide range of backgrounds, wide range of ethnicities, demographics. You want to be show that they are welcome, and you want to, you know, do what it takes to make them feel welcome, right?
I would say what's important is, or what's also important, would be the process of immersion. So I've written about this a few times, but basically we're talking about three key things. We're talking about observing constancy. So I mean, it's not enough that we have an event, which this is a great event, obviously, but we can't leave here and say, oh man, that was great, and then not talk about these issues until next year. So I mean, if you're talking about what we all think about or what we all address on a daily basis with friends, family, colleagues, when we think about our pet issues, when we're talking about observing constancy, we're talking about putting these issues on the front burner rather than the back burner, and realizing that you don't make progress just by, as Dr. King put it, a horse and buggy pace. Because if you just sit there or let it sit there, then you're not going to really get anywhere. So I think it's important to actually observe constancy, constantly talking about these things, discussing them with the people, specifically with the people who are being affected by whatever type of ism, whatever type of discrimination or oppression. I think the second thing that's important and is interrelated to the first point is granting a platform. If you're someone who, if you're not part of an outgroup, then it's preferable that you allow your perspective, your worldview, to be informed by those who are of the outgroup. I mean, because how else are you going to learn about these issues unless you actually just shut up for a minute and listen? That goes all across the board. It goes when it comes to male privilege. It comes when we're talking about white privilege. When we're talking about cis privilege. When we're talking about straight privilege. So on and so forth. It's the same thing. You have to be able or willing to grant a platform to those who are in a position of marginalization, and allowing them to tell you what is affecting them, what's adversely affecting them, and able to ruminate about that. And I think the third thing is perspective taking, and that's also interrelated with granting a platform. Granting a platform to the people who are marginalized. If you're not marginalized, shut up and just listen for a minute to what these marginalized people have to say.
Obviously, since I'm a huge advocate for education, if we had more multicultural and just fact-based education, I think that would perpetuate a better and equitable society, as well as collaborating with as many people with as many backgrounds as possible so we can have our goals be met, as well as, and I'm going to piggyback off what he was saying. I think he was trying to say that political participation is very, very important. I totally agree. But in order for you to be active, we need to stop voter suppression.
Is it a consensus that a lot of what's been said is working within the system, working within, voting, working within coalition building and things like that? But is that not just building on top of something that foundationally was meant to have oppressors and oppressees? Is it not better to just burn it down basically and rebuild it?
Okay, most people don't want to do that.
Is that possible? Is that realistic?
Well, the answer is yes. That would be my preferred anyway. But I entertain the idea of revolution. Most of us do not, right? even when you take a look at who we have in the Democratic primaries, well, it's just different varying of the same thing. It's not real revolution. It's not real change. The question that I wind up having, especially for Bernie supporters, is he's talking political revolution. I was like, okay, so if you consider yourself a revolutionary yourself and he doesn't actually win, what are you willing to do to bring about that change, right? That's that second scary question that nobody wants to deal with, because most of us, even though this country was founded on revolution and bloodshed, right? We're not willing to do that to get what we need or what we want. So we do continue to support a system of oppression, and we'll put Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid, and it'll, it's like that ugly paint that's like 15 layers deep. It's still ugly, and at the core of the house, it's rotten. We haven't addressed it, absolutely. But again, I have to pick the armies wisely, because when we start talking about political revolution, I may have a few million people. When I start talking about real revolution, I got a room full.
But don't you think that, like, if you're looking at other revolutions, like I'm thinking about the civil rights, the civil war in Nicaragua, or the many wars that are going on in Africa where people are demanding their rights, and things are better here than a lot of places in the global south. But when I hear revolution, I also hear war, because that's the way that it generally goes. As a humanist, I'm a pacifist. I'm not sure that I would be willing to make this country a war-torn country, because I've seen how
we're being shot in the streets right now. I mean, and I'm not trying to editorialize and argue or anything like that, but I just want that to be clear. We are already being killed every day. And that's what a lot of people don't understand when we talk about revolution. There's already bloodshed. I mean, how do we not? We've been here all day long. We know this. I'm not saying, go, well, I can't help, but anyway, that's all. I'm sorry. I do get passionate. I definitely do, because we already are in a war. And whether or not that affects you personally is one thing, but we already are.
I think it affects us all. It's just that I study conflict resolution, and I study heavy human rights abuses, and I will definitely say that human rights abuses here are just as bad as other places. But war, the way that revolution is being made is a lot bloodier, and it's just, it's so incredibly disheartening. I wouldn't want anyone to go through that.
What did Audre Lorde mean when she said the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house? What are the weapons of the state? Their violence, their oppression. So if we take this upon ourselves, it's not going to beat them by using their own game. We're going to have to get around it by using something more sophisticated and something that's more practical than us in this room going out and getting guns and going and shooting at police officers or something like that. It's just not a good idea.
Okay.
Also, you're talking about...
We're going to have to close. Oh, sorry. We've got to close. Sorry. And we're going to close appropriately so on that Audre Lorde quote. I'm sorry that I didn't get to address all the hands that were raised in the audience. Can we give our panel members